First of all, what do you think is the most pressing issue in Scottish football right now?
I think the most pressing issue, I guess, is the one of moving on. I think inevitably we've had to deal with, Scottish football has to deal with so many issues over the past 6 months that there's a kind of, I guess, a negativity and a depression around Scottish football. And I think the most important thing there is that we try and put some of that behind us, and we look to ways in which we can build Scottish football and to build on some of the strengths and some of the positive things that perhaps come out of the very challenging circumstances. So I think it's about moving forward and trying to learn from mistakes that are being made at a club level, but also at a structural level too.
Mm-hmm. Within that, how important do you think league reconstruction is to the future of the game in Scotland?
I think it's a tricky one. I think league reconstruction is something that clearly has to be addressed because we've been talking about it now for a number of years. And I think what I think I'd like to see is people to revisit some of the work that perhaps Henry McLeish has done in this area, and try and get a number of different groups to have an inclusive debate about what is the best kind of league structure for Scotland, bearing in mind the size of the country, the number of clubs we have, and the different pressures, financial and sporting pressures, that are inevitably faced by the different clubs. But I think we need to now do something with the discussion about reconstruction, not just have it as there, that's something we always fall back to saying, well, we need to think about this. We've got to do something and move this on.
Fan ownership is a big topic of debate right now. How important do you think it is that fans have a say and stake in how their clubs are run?
I think it's fundamental. I mean, I think I've long thought that was a very important aspect of, particularly the kind of clubs that we have in Scottish football. I think one of the few, perhaps, good things that has come out of the Rangers debacle has been the way in which supporters have not just had a voice that can be heard, but one that's been listened to. I think for too long we had a kind of dialogue with the deaf, where we knew the supporters had certain views, but we never actually got a chance to build those views into decision making. I think that's been something that's been very positive that's come out of this, and we've got to build on that. And I think for a lot of clubs, involving supporters in the ownership model is clearly a way forward, because the traditional model, the one we've grown used to, doesn't seem to work. It's failed on too many occasions, and I think this is an opportunity to see clubs think about a different model, a more inclusive model. And I think with that model for supporters, with rights that would come with ownership, come responsibilities too. And it is time for supporters to recognise that we need to have a different approach to their football clubs, and to recognise that there are enormous challenges over running some of these clubs in anything close to a profitable or break-even model. And I think therefore there's responsibilities as well as rights.
Mm-hmm. You said back in July that if Rangers did end up in the third division of Scottish football, it would be a tipping point within the game. We're now 1 month into the new season. How has the game responded to their admission into the third division?
Yeah, I think I'm probably not the only person to look back at some of these things and think, well, in a sense, I'm delighted so far, but that was in a sense exaggerated, or that hasn't come to pass. I think that perhaps the most important issue there was, I think, like a lot of people who were kind of commenting on what could happen. One was talking about what could happen, and I certainly had no privileged knowledge about what Sky or other broadcasters were going to do. And I think what really was being talked about there was what could be the worst that could happen. And the worst that could happen, if you suddenly removed a great chunk of broadcasting income, which at that point certainly seemed like a possibility, was that you would have had a fundamental altering of the economic structure of a number of these clubs. Clearly the situation hasn't transpired in that way, and that of course is very positive, and nobody wanted to see that situation come to pass. I think at the moment, however, I would still say, I would still exercise a little bit of caution. I think a lot of clubs are still in a very fragile economic condition, and I think we've got to be careful that we don't see this as some kind of solution. What we've got perhaps a little bit is a get-out-jail card, but we've got to build on that. We've got to look at models that will actually create a sustainable club structure and a sustainable industry. I don't think we're there yet.
Do you think Scottish football can actually be a profitable industry? It's quite a general question, yeah. I know, but
to be honest, I don't think Scottish football should seek to be a profitable industry. I think what it should seek to be is a sustainable industry. I think what we have here are, for the very most part, a lot of organisations that operate in corporate clothes but exist as not-for-profit organisations. I think that's what they should do. I think every penny that a sports organisation is trying to make should be reinvested in some way in delivering the goals of that sports organisation. That doesn't just mean investing in kind of player wages, or not investing in player wages, but incurring extra costs in player wages. It means kind of sustaining the kind of social infrastructure that these clubs have, the community infrastructure. But I think that's something that we should be looking to do. So it's not about profitability, it's about sustainability, it's about building a kind of a social enterprise, the main part of which is delivering sport, delivering football, but it's also about being an active part of his community. And I think if we can get to that situation or that structure, that's appropriate for most of the clubs I think in Scotland. In fact, you look at bigger organisations too, it isn't about generating a return. I don't think it should be about generating a return for financial investors. It should be about trying to ensure that you maximise sporting success, social outcomes while remaining solvent. Ultimately, the main social responsibility, however, is to keep the organisation in business. And I think we mustn't lose sight of that either, that if you run it in a way which doesn't allow you to be financially sustainable, you haven't got anything left at all, because you end up running the risk of another Rangers, the club goes out of business. And I think that's not good for, in any kind of social way, the outcomes that we saw from Rangers.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, considering everything that has happened this summer, now is football fans' opportunities to have themselves heard within the game?
Yeah, I hope so. I think that kind of notion of voice that we talked about earlier on. People have talked about that for a number of years, but I think that phrase I used earlier on about the kind of dialogue of the deaf, that was something that always struck me was going on around football supporters in the past. For all the reasons that we know about, the voice was certainly much more. It had to be listened to this time. I think it had to be listened to at the level of individual clubs. I think the challenge now is to make sure it's listened to when we look at things like structure and the organisation of the game more generally, as well as at the level of individual clubs. But I hope that we can build on that and that we can see a more sustainable, inclusive model for football going forward in Scotland.
And just finally, would you encourage fans to have their say on Scottish football through the Scottish Fans website and to complete a survey asking them a range of questions about how they feel the state of the game is and encourage them to voice their opinions?
Absolutely, I think that's because I guess one of the challenges when we talk about fans and supporters, we kind of give this sense that it's some kind of homogenous grouping that everybody thinks the same way. The reality is, as we know, is quite different. So I think anything of the nature of the survey that is going to be carried out, I think I absolutely encourage people to do that, because that is the way that people can begin to understand the kinds of attitudes and views people have on the game. And we'll also recognise the diversity of those views, because there is going to be a difference of opinion about things like structures and about ownership models, but it's important that gets understood and that there's an opportunity for that voice to be heard in different ways and for different voices to be heard.
Perfect.
So please visit scottishfans.org in order to get your voice heard.